Hey guys, we don't particularly want to address this topic, but as our channel is about Japan and in the interests of getting accurate information out there, we're going to address it again. We actually did address it once a couple of years ago in response to some comments that we've been getting about it and some questions we had been getting about it. And in that video we actually suggested that the atom bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not necessary. We gently suggested that perhaps it was more to do with competition between America and Russia at the time that prompted it to happen. And that actually attracted quite a lot of comments to the contrary, where people got quite emotional about it. Now, what's prompted this video today is there's been a video and a book released by Oliver Stone and a few other people called The Untold History of the United States. And these guys did some really good research and came up with information from lots of credible people that basically supported that thinking, or that fact that at the time it wasn't really necessary to drop the atom bombs, and that Japan was very, very close to surrendering. And basically the point that was stopping them at the time was reluctance of the Allies to allow the Emperor to stay on, and that the Japanese people wanted the Emperor to keep the Emperor because he's considered to be very important in Japanese life, so they wanted to keep him, and the Allies said that they wouldn't agree to that, so that was the sticking point. But the Japanese were very close to surrendering. At the time, the Japanese were very worried about the Russians getting involved, because the Russians had finished fighting the Germans, and the Germans were over, had surrendered and they were finished. So the Russians were then looking at the Japanese and saying, you know, considering whether they'd get involved. And the Japanese were in China at the time, and if the Russians got involved fighting the Japanese, they knew it would be game over for them, and they were really worried about the Russians turning on them. And the Russians did. And basically, when Stone and these other people looked into the history and looked into the documents and the witnesses from the time, the Japanese people the Japanese bosses were surrendering because the Russians had entered the conflict, and that it wasn't because of the atom bomb. But the atom bomb was used, as we suggested earlier, the atom bomb was actually used as a demonstration to the Russians that the Americans had the bomb, and they wanted to show the Russians that they had it. They wanted to show how effective it was, and to put them, you know, in a stronger position against the Russians, because the competition was building with them at the time. So it wasn't necessary, as we suggested in the other video. So what we would suggest, we'll put a link down in the description to this particular documentary. It's well worth, it's a book and it's a DVD. It's well worth having a look at, and you can check yourself to see the facts of it, because at the time that all this went on, the people who were in the know, the military people and the people that had developed the bomb, were all saying, don't use it. So even the military knew there was no need to use it, but the politicians decided to use it. And if you look at what's claimed in this documentary, and you can check it yourself, and you can see that all the timing and everything else that happened, it's relevant. So again, obviously there'll be people who don't want to know this. That's the interesting thing about history, is that people prefer to believe a version of history that makes them more comfortable, and it's more comfortable to believe what we were told, that the reason the bomb was dropped was it would save millions of lives. And it's interesting, they showed a quote from the American president at the time, and he said in 1945 he said it had saved hundreds of thousands of lives, and then a couple of years later he said that it saved 500,000 lives, and then 5 years later he said it had saved 1 million lives. So it's much, you know, it shows, doesn't it? But it's much more comfortable for us to believe that the reason that there was atomic bombs dropped on those two cities was to save hundreds of thousands of lives of both Americans and Japanese people, because if the Americans had invaded, you know, hundreds of thousands of people would have been killed in the fighting, and that it saved American lives and Japanese lives by doing it. And it's much more comfortable for us to believe that. But the bottom line is it's not true. That, you know, if the atom bomb had been dropped on an uninhabited island somewhere as a demonstration, that would have had the same effect. But the bottom line was that the American politicians wanted to show the Russians exactly what they could do with it. So they picked Hiroshima because it was a city that until then hadn't been bombed much, so it was in really good condition. A lot of the other cities had already been bombed, so Hiroshima hadn't been, so it gave them a chance to have a city that was in good condition, so they could have before and after shots basically. They had all the footage, the aerial photography of before the bombing, and they could show the photography of what happened after the bombing. So that's basically what it was. It was a demonstration to the Russians of what they could do. So, to those of you who don't believe it, who prefer to believe the more comfortable story, that's your choice. To those people who are interested in really finding out the truth about this, I would strongly suggest having a look at this story by Oliver Stone and these other guys, and look at the information and the facts, and particularly listen, not just on this topic either. These guys came up with all the statistics that we don't get shown very often, you know, and the reality of it. And the Russians played the biggest part in defeating the Germans. The Russians also played the biggest part in defeating the Japanese, and the Russians also showed or gave up. More Russians died in World War II than in any other nationality, by far. Have a look at the statistics. The statistics are amazing, absolutely amazing. And there's so many things that through our eyes, the English-speaking people's eyes, and our history that we were shown and taught, and the difference between that and the reality was basically a whole heap of propaganda. So have a look. Have a look at that documentary. It's excellent. Not only will it open your eyes about the Hiroshima Nagasaki thing, but it'll probably open your eyes about a whole heap of other things as well. If you're interested in having your eyes opened, of course. A lot of other people would much prefer to believe the more comfortable history, and that's fine as well. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but those people who really want to know the facts, I'd suggest watch this documentary and then check into it for yourself and confirm it for yourself. It's very interesting. So anyway, I hope somebody gets some interest or some benefit out of this. More videos coming soon.